I wanted to thank all of our supporters, everyone that's helped us every little bit. I'm sorry that I couldn't name all the names on the slide, but of course, thank you to the LUMC for providing the room for us at no charge. That was very, very generous. Of course, the Unrest team for helping us to get the film scrap for organizing all the logistics. Of course, our three guest speakers tonight who graciously volunteered their time to come do this for us. And the many volunteers. I mean, yeah, I started this, but there were a lot of people that I really helped to support me to get this realized. And then we have a lot of donors already, so I really want to thank you for that.
Deconditioning or disease? That's the question. I will not go to all the details of the slides to save some time, but I will point out the most important parts. So, literature is full of, it's all deconditioning. Go and exercise and it will go better. It's mainly on POTS, but what we did in our data is check on two separate ways for deconditioning. The first, the cardiopulmonary exercise test, and the second, the activity bracelet sense wear. We used from Parpsych, Mayo Clinics, the definition of deconditioning based on the CPAT with a cutoff of 85% or more, and severe is even less than 65. Then, for the second part of the activity bracelet, we validated the CPAT results with some senseware results, and as you can see, a linear correlation is present. So that is what we used for the second part. So what we did is check all patients undergoing head-up tilt test, and mainly the ones with a normal hemodynamic result. So the kind of test that people get congratulated about. Fantastic, nothing wrong with you. Some of them had a CPAT, some of them had a sensor bracelet. And this is what we found on the CPAT part. 18 healthy volunteers, 59 patients with no deconditioning based on CPAT, and 174 patients with deconditioning. When you're looking at cerebral blood flow, healthy volunteers only go down by a mean of 5%. Patients, however, whether they are not deconditioned or deconditioned, go down for about 20–22%. That's a rather big difference. When you split them up even further with severity of deconditioning, no deconditioning, mild deconditioning, severe deconditioning, you see the same pattern, a huge difference compared to healthy volunteers. Kind of a signal that there must be something wrong. Then we looked at the activity bracelet, and what we first did, we found 121 patients with a normal head-up tilt test who wore the bracelet, and first we kind of correlated the number of steps with the severity of disease. And as you can see, there's a gradual decline in steps, 8,400 in the mild patients, almost 5,000 in the moderate patients, so homebound patients, and 2,100 in the severe patients who are bedridden. Next step we did was in 9 healthy volunteers who wore a sensor bracelet, 7,800 steps. We searched patients with a similar amount of steps, 31 of them, and then checked cerebral blood flow. And again, as you saw with the CPAT results, a huge difference. 5% versus 22–23%. So with the same amount of steps, a huge difference. That cannot be deconditioning, because they do the same.
May I ask what is cerebral blood flow in Dutch?
Doorstroming van het bloed naar het hoofd.
Kijk, dan snap ik.
Oops. Next, we looked at the same results with the different severities of disease, and what you can see here, the pointer is not very good. On the picture on the left is even with the more severe disease, the decline in cerebral blood flow is the same. The picture on the right shows it in a different graphic design. Whether you do 800 steps or 11,000 steps, your cerebral blood flow decline will be exactly the same. So a kick under your ass, go and do something more and it will all fade away. Bullshit. So, our data suggests that the cerebral blood flow decline we found is not caused by deconditioning, as evidenced by our results with the CPAT and as evidenced by the SenseWare bracelet. Even with several severities of disease, the picture you see in cerebral blood flow decline is the same. So, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Van Campen. Yeah, I know some of you hear music. That's coming from downstairs, and we've already told them to try to be quiet twice, and yeah, you still hear it, and I think it's getting louder. So, I'm sorry about that. Now we will, I'll hand it over to Dr. David Tuller.
Well, I'll go up here. I don't know. Maybe I'll just stand here. First, I wanted to take off my shirt here and show my T-shirt, because this T-shirt says "Paceman," and it was made for me a year and a half ago before I came to Amsterdam and gave a talk. It was a screening of an earlier documentary by Ryan Pryor, and I gave a talk, and Neil van der Zee, my friend, made this T-shirt for me. So I just thought I'd wear it again. So I'm not I'm a social scientist and a journalist, so I'm not a scientist or a clinician, so I can't really speak on the medical aspects of the illness particularly. But I can speak just a little bit about what doesn't work, and sort of my role in this has been to look at the PACE trial, which was some of the basis, or the largest trial anyway, that tested the treatments that everybody knows don't work, cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise therapy, and found that they worked. And that trial really is a fraudulent piece of garbage and should be retracted, but I think maybe I don't know if it'll be retracted, but at least it seems to be being discredited, at least in other countries, not so far yet in your country. Hopefully that will be happening soon. You have your own cohort of people doing the same kind of shoddy, stupid research here, and I looked at some of that research, and it's also very poor and really doesn't prove what they claim it does. So, which is that cognitive behavior therapy and graded exercise therapy work. We know they don't, and so I think hopefully it seems I sort of got into this almost 2 years ago when I first started writing about the PACE trial, and so I do feel like there just seemed to have been a big change generally, at least in the US a lot, somewhat in the UK, and I'm hoping here a little bit. It does seem there seem to be more publications and people talking about it in a realistic way. So I hope, in a year and a half, if I come back here again, it will be a completely different situation, because I do think it's progressed in the year and a half that I've been here, since I was here the last time. So that's basically what I have to say, so I'll hand it over actually to Charles now.
Thank you, David. I'm just going to talk a little bit about, in my presentation, what I think the patient community can do to maintain the momentum of this very powerful and thought-provoking film that we've been looking at. And having been involved with both the preparation and the production of this film, it is so rewarding to see what is happening, certainly in the UK, as a result of us being able to show this film to both the public, the politicians, and now even the medical profession. And I'll come to that in a minute. What I'd just like to do to start off with is by saying thank you to Roland and his small team, because I didn't know Roland until about 3 weeks or so ago. And Roland, to me, it was completely out of the blue, wrote to me and said, would I come over and do this? I said, yeah, I'd love to do it. We're doing these showings in the UK, it'd be great to come over here. And I know from following what Roland's been doing over the past 3 weeks that Roland and a pretty small team have done an incredible amount of work, time and effort into putting this screening on here tonight at the University of Leiden. It's an amazing thing to be able to do. And the one thing I'm going to say, which Roland probably won't, is that it also costs quite a lot of money to do this. And there is a donation box. And I hope if you haven't donated, you will dig deep before you go out, because it has cost a bit of money to put this on. So please think about that. For people who don't know, I'm one of these docs who got into this wretched illness through personal experience. Like many docs of my generation, and we've had that on the film, I was told at medical school this was all hysterical nonsense. That was back at the Middlesex Hospital in London in the sort of late 1960s, early 1970s. Go away and forget about it. You won't see any patients with this. It's just a total non-disease. And I was working in hospital medicine quite a few years later. The typical story of a person with this illness, fit young adults, no health problems in the past. I got a dose of chicken pox, which I picked up from one of my patients who had shingles, and went down with all the typical ME symptoms. And my problem at the time is that no doctors that I went to knew what was going on, no one believed what was causing my condition, and I received no diagnosis for nearly 2 years, and I received either totally useless management advice or no management advice at all. And those are things which have changed a bit for the better in the UK in over 30 years since this happened, but nowhere near at the speed that they should be, and I know that the same position applies to countries in really the rest of Europe. So for the past 30 years I've been involved in just about every aspect of this illness, from clinical aspects to research aspects to medical aspects and politics. And I think there are some real changes happening. Nancy Klimas, you remember I know Nancy well, she's a wonderful immunologist in the film. Nancy Klimas talked about the role of the mitochondria, and that's, I think, terribly important, because at a cellular level, I think we are dealing with an illness in which the cells in the body are not responding to demands that are being put on them when you want energy, whether that's physical energy or mental energy. So you can't perform physically, you can't sustain physical energy when you want to do so, and equally, you can't sustain mental energy. And Linda's also explained some of the reasons why that might be occurring, because of problems with cerebral blood flow. Now, almost 30 years ago, I took some, I didn't actually take it out myself, but one of my colleagues took out some of my skeletal muscle. And we looked at it under the microscope. And we also did what we call magnetic resonance spectroscopy experiments on my skeletal muscle. And we demonstrated in my individual case that there was a problem with these mitochondria. These are the Duracell batteries within your cells, that they were not performing correctly. And that's 30 years ago. We've known this for over 30 years, but because the psychiatrists have taken over this disease, as we've heard from David, we've heard from other people, we've heard in the film, biomedical research into this illness has not taken place at the rate that it should have done, and findings which were promising in the past have just been ignored, and we're only just getting round to looking at these things again and making some progress. And if you're interested in this, we've got this paper up on the ME Association website. It's received a lot of publicity all over the place, but a very important paper came out about 2 or 3 weeks ago from the University of Newcastle. The lead author is Cara Thomas. whom we know because the ME Association is part of the funding for this research. And this is backing up yet again the fact that cells in the body cannot produce energy when they are when they're stressed through either physical or mental activity. That is sound biomedical research in a reputable medical journal. If you want something to take to your doc here and now, demonstrating what that film is trying to show you, then there's a paper that you can show them. Now, just to go back again quickly onto the film. The film, I've been involved with a number of these screenings around the UK over the past few weeks, and it's really quite tremendous what has been happening. The BBC, which I'm sure most people are aware of, our national broadcaster in the UK, have really taken this film to heart. I've been with Jen, we've been on BBC Breakfast News, the main news programme for the BBC. Jen has done television news programmes for other channels. The film has been reported in the Times, the Telegraph, the Mail, most of the daily newspapers. And only yesterday it was the main human interest item on the BBC website. So the media have got it. We are lucky in the charity that I work for that our patron, one of our patrons, is an MP called John Berkow. And John is the Speaker of the House of Commons. And John let us have the state rooms at the House of Commons 2 weeks ago for a period of 2 hours. And we put on a lunchtime event. We had Jen there, who spoke. We had a member of the House of Lords who spoke. I spoke. Jessica, who was on the film, came along. She didn't speak, but she was there. And we had over 50 MPs there at that meeting. So in addition to making friends with the media, getting the media on your side, if you're going to make things better in the Netherlands for people with ME/CFS, you've got to get the media on board, you've got to get your politicians on board. I don't know what the state of politics here is in relation to ME/CFS. I do know because we were in The Hague this afternoon, and purely by chance we were walking through Parliament, and just after 2 o'clock, virtually the entire cabinet came out of the door. The telecameras were there, so I know, and I've actually managed to photograph quite a few of these people as well. I didn't know who I was photographing, but people kept telling me. So I've seen your cabinet. It's obviously a pretty young cabinet, it's a pretty diverse cabinet, but I think you do need to be making inroads into your politicians to get them to recognise. Now, the hardest nut to crack is your medical profession. And as far as the film is concerned, it's heartening to see, we've hopefully got some doctors and nurses and people here today, but certainly over in the UK, this film has attracted medical attention, and we're having screenings which actually involve the medical profession. I'm doing one at the University of Sheffield Medical School next week, and we have one at what's called the Royal Society, which is the most prestigious scientific society in the whole of the UK, doing a screening next week, 2 weeks' time, followed by a discussion along these lines. So I think there are 3 strands that you need to be thinking of if you're going to try and make life better for people with ME/CFS here in the Netherlands, involving the media, involving your politicians, and the hardest nut to crack is involving the medical establishment. David mentioned the PACE trial, and I'm going to close now because we want to have some discussion on this, but I know from my discussions about the situation in the Netherlands is that your medical system seems to follow largely ours. You have primary care, you have secondary care, it's state funded. But you do, unfortunately, take notice, as many European countries do, of something called the NICE guideline, which you may or may not have heard of, but that is a guideline in the UK. Doctors are issued with guidelines on every single disease that they deal with, and quite frankly, the NICE guideline, which was produced in 2007, is unfit for purpose. We have been saying this for years because it is dominated by the oversimplistic view that everyone with this condition, this disease, should be treated with CBT, which for the majority of people is ineffective, and or graded exercise therapy, which for the majority of people makes their condition worse. We've been banging on about this for ages and ages and ages, and we were gratified that we had managed to overturn the medical establishment, and this reminds me of the episode with Per Fink, the the psychiatrist on the film, because the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the Royal College of Physicians opposed the NICE guideline being reviewed, and I'll just hand this mic to David because I'm going to do something he did with the PACE trial, which I think is very appropriate. And the NICE guideline has now been torn up, as with the PACE trial, and we're going to have a new NICE guideline. So I'm not going to say anything more because I think we want some questions and answers which Roland is going to supervise. David, you've got one quick point.
I just want to say one point, which was going back to the 50s, to the Royal Free outbreak in London. Last time when I was in June, I interviewed patient number 234 from that outbreak. So she's an 82-year-old retired GP, and she was towards the end of that outbreak. And so the point is basically back then they knew what to do. Because she was toward the end, they already knew that people who seemed to get better and went back to work, these were nurses mainly, got worse again, relapsed. So by the time it came to her, they put her to bed for 6 months. She got better, never had another problem, went on to her GP practice, was actually surprised I was interested in interviewing her because she said there was nothing really of interest she had to say. She didn't get very sick. She never, she went to bed and got better. I told her it was sort of like meeting someone from the Titanic, like someone at the seminal event of whatever. So it was actually very interesting to talk to her and to realize that back then they already knew what to do, which was to rest it off till you're better. And for 50 years, that, or more, that, knowledge was kind of lost. So.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. I think we're going to go through with the Q&A, and Dr. van Campen will join the panel in the front. So I am going to turn on the discussion mics. You see the microphones in front of you. If you press on the button, it should light up red, and then you should be able to talk into it. Press on the button, talk into the mic, and then, I'm going to let the first question go. Can someone just test the microphone for me?
Hello, hello. Hello, hello.
There we go.
It's working.
Great, that's working. Okay, so anybody with a first question that they wanted to ask any of our speakers? I hear crickets. Okay, yeah, there.
Hi, I'm Natasha. I work in psychiatry. It's a bit awkward, but...
It's great, you can come. Thank you.
So, what can we do at this point in time? Is there any way to have is there something pointing toward a somatic evidence for CFS already, or are we not at that stage yet that we can apply it in clinical setting?
Sorry, are you saying, is there any evidence that we are dealing with a biomedical condition?
That is useful in a clinical setting at this
time. Right. I mean, there is let's put it this way, there is an enormous amount of evidence now that we are dealing with a condition that is invariably triggered by an infection. There is query as to whether that infection that triggers this illness persists, or whether there may be reactivated viral infection going on involving Epstein-Barr virus, herpes virus, or whatever. But when the disease, we feel, is maintained by abnormalities in the immune system response, and if you look at some of the most recent papers, particularly the stuff that's come from Montoya in the States, this is Montoya at Stanford in the States, looking at cytokine profiles in these patients. Certainly in the early stages there is a disruption in the cytokine responses, and it may well be that the reason these people have ongoing flu-like symptoms is that they are continuing to pour out cytokines, these inflammatory immune chemicals that you normally pour out when you've got a flu-like infection, which makes you feel grotty, flu-like and everything else. In combination with that, we feel that this immune system dysfunction is having an effect on certain control centres in the brain, particularly the autonomic nervous system control centres, which helps to explain the research that Linda's been explaining and why so many of these people have POTS and autonomic nervous system dysfunction. And then the third component of this, as I say, is the evidence of a cellular problem at a mitochondrial level, which seems to be explaining why these people cannot sustain physical and mental energy, and why their baseline level of physical and mental activity, although they want to do things, they just cannot plug in and start doing things at a normal rate. I'm quite happy. I've got a copy of my purple book here, which has got all the key. It's got 600 references to all the key papers in. Please come down at the end, and I'll give you a free one.
And if you get bored this weekend, we can recommend the American Institute of Medicine report site of over 300 pages.
All right, great.
And sorry, do read the paper which is, as I say, just come out from Tara Thomas et al. On cellular bioenergetics in CFS.
I will do so. Thank you.
Are you from the University of Leiden?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, thank you for the question. We have a question over here.
What was the author of the article that you just... didn't catch it. I'm sorry.
The author of this paper is Cara Thomas, that's C-A-R-A, and it's T-O-M-A-S. If you go to the ME Association website, we've got the whole paper there as a PDF if you want to download it. Free.
Could I remind you guys to talk into the microphone so that, because we're recording it on Facebook Live, so we'd like to be able to catch audio. Great, thanks. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, please go ahead. Are they not working?
I can scream a little.
No, I'll bring the microphone to you.
Thank you. My English is not so good, but I'll try. What do you advise a patient who gets stuck with this disease, like me? Because I can, when I go to doctors, I see many, like many of us, I think. But yeah, what can I tell them? What do you advise? There is about 10 years ago, they say I have this disease, but I get some therapy from the Radboud and cognitive gedragstherapie, but it didn't work.
Could you sort of explain what their options are as far as specialists refer?
Well, in the Netherlands, outside of the Radboud Center, which is now located in the Academic Medical Center in Amsterdam, it's moved. There's 3 centers, basically, where you can go to. Lelystad, which has some internal medicine. Our center, we look at cardiovascular and the total picture. And you have the center in Amsterdam, which is commercial. So that's not from your health insurance base. That's kind of the 3 options that are trying to be as serious as possible with this disease.
Could I just add that there are probably 3 different components to dealing with the management of this illness in our current state of knowledge, because we haven't got a drug at the moment that can treat the underlying disease process, although there are experimental drugs which are being tried in clinical trials which are aimed at looking at, an effective treatment for the disease itself, one of which is from the film antiviral drugs. The other more important one is a drug called rituximab, which many people here may have heard about, and that is undergoing what's called a phase 3 clinical trial in Norway at the moment. Those results will come out early in the new year, and that's possibly the most promising drug as far as an underlying disease treatment is concerned, but that is some way off. But in the meantime, what ideally should be happening is that your doctor in what we call primary care, your GP, should be helping you with certain of the key components, which is symptom management, which is managing symptoms, pain, sleep disturbance, orthostatic intolerance, the autonomic nervous system problems. And where your GP is not feeling confident enough to be able to manage those, then, as Linda said, you should be then being referred on to a hospital-based service where they can give more help with, the rather more tricky aspects of management. And the other key aspect of management, which sadly gets forgotten or is just not done very well, is the whole business of activity management. And that, in my view, at the moment in our current state of knowledge, because we haven't got a drug to treat this disease, is the most important aspect of management. So that's correctly balancing your physical, mental, emotional activity so that you're not going at one end of the extreme and doing nothing, as it were, but at the same point not trying to exercise or do too much and making yourself worse as a process. So you've got to learn a process, we call it pacing, which is the careful management of your physical energy, your emotional energy, your mental energy, so you're not continually pushing yourself to the point of exacerbation of symptoms or relapse. Sadly, this requires education of the medical profession, because unless you have educated doctors who have seen patients with this, who understand the research that's going on and the things that they can do, they are not going to be able to give you this knowledge and give you this information, which explains why in many, many cases, and I'm sure it's the case here, what happens is that patients just become expert patients. They know more about this disease than their doctors, and in many cases it's the patient telling the doctor what the doctor ought to be telling the patient.
Okay, do we have any other questions from the audience at the moment? Yeah.
A question for David. Could you give a short survey of the influence of the IOM report on the society in the United States? What its influence is?
Say it louder.
Could you perceive any influence of the IOM report on the American society?
What was the impact of the IOM report? I think the IOM report, so the IOM is the Institute of Medicine, although it's now renamed the National Academy of Medicine in the US, and they were commissioned to produce a report, which they produced in 2015, in which so it had a mixed impact. I think overall, that year, the Institute of Medicine and the National Institutes of Health both released reports which made it clear that after reviewing all the literature, that this was a very serious physiological illness. So in my own work, it's been very helpful to be able to say, in 2015, both two agencies released these reports. The Institute of Medicine, so I think it has had a big impact. You can always point to that and say, this is what they found. The report was also important because it focused specifically on post-exertional malaise, which the IOM panel renamed it exertion intolerance, and came up with a bad name for the overall disease, systemic exertion intolerance disease, which nobody liked. So everybody was unhappy about that. But people were happy that it made it clear that this was a serious physiological organic illness, and that the core symptom, the characteristic symptom, was post-exertional malaise or exertion intolerance, and not just some sort of generalized fatigue. So I think that's been very helpful and an important thing to be able to cite.
Yeah, but how can you perceive the influence of it in the daily practices of general practitioners?
Well, so getting that information out in general is a lot harder. I think one of the issues is that, for example, the CDC just released, the Centers for Disease Control just changed their guidelines. If people don't act in responsible, honorable ways, public health officials and government people, it makes it harder. So the Centers for Disease Control has been pressured for a number of years to remove CBT and GET. They finally removed all mention of the PACE trial more than a year ago, But they then pretended that CBT and GET were generic management strategies for the illness that had nothing to do with PACE, which is totally nonsense and ridiculous. Of course, it had everything to do with PACE. This summer, in early July or late June, they took away CBT and GET as their main recommendations. However, they didn't announce this, they didn't make it public, they just changed the website, and so when I finally contacted them and said, well, why did you do this? They said, well, people were confused by what we meant about exercise and CBT. Well, that's ridiculous. Nobody was confused about what they meant. Everybody just knew that they were wrong. Everybody knew what they were saying and they were wrong. And they refused to actually say, we're sorry, we were wrong. They refused to make an announcement about this change. They refused to tell the Mayo Clinic, Kaiser Permanente, all our big medical centers that still have these treatments. They refused to contact them so far and say, you have to make these changes. So I don't know how to get the IOM information or to get the other information out there when public health people who are supposed to be doing their job are not doing their job.
It's Rob, isn't it? It is. Hi. Can I just add to that? Because in our discussions with NICE to get our NICE guideline totally revised and the old one scrapped, the most important current report from anywhere that NICE actually did take into account, as well as the arguments that we were putting forward, was the Institute of Medicine report. And I think if you want to use a report in any sort of campaigning way with the politicians or the medical profession or the media over here in the Netherlands to get some improvement in services and everything that goes with it, then I think I would go with the Institute of Medicine report. As David says, it did come up with this very unfortunate name, which is systemic exertion intolerance disease. Unfortunately, you spell it backwards, it spells dies, which is a very, very unfortunate state. I don't like it. It didn't go down well at all with public opinion in the UK. But the report is a very useful report if you want to use it for campaigning.
I think, Rob, they have another problem here, which is that the IOM itself has been criticized by Leitenberg or by whoever, I forget who, right, publicly, and they sort of made it seem like you could pay your way into being in the IOM. I mean, all this kind of nonsense. So that's really ridiculous. You know, you can't go into people's brains and sort of, you know, change their flawed thinking. I mean, I guess the PACE people think you can, but I mean, basically, the IOM is very well respected. If the Dutch medical health authorities think it's not, then they have a lot of problems beyond just this one.
It was the president of the Dutch Health Council, who said they needed to add quality to the IOM report. Because there were so many, 1,000 new researchers, and they had to investigate that, he said. So the Dutch Health Council is going to add quality to the IOM report. How far can they go?
Do you have influence with the Dutch? Are you part of it? Or?
I wish I had, but I don't. I can only expose this rather strange way of thinking.
The other thing that should be said, so I mentioned also the, you know, both the IOM report and the NIH report also made very clear statements that this was not a psychiatric disorder, that this was not related to, you know, this was not about deconditioning. And the NIH report specifically called for the Oxford criteria, which just requires 6 months of fatigue, to be retired or to be done away with. You know, that, you know, some of your own studies in this country rely on the Oxford criteria or Oxford criteria kinds of case definitions. So one of my favorites was a study from 2001, which they said they're using the CDC criteria, except for the requirement that patients fulfill 4 of 8 other criteria. So it's the CDC criteria, except for one of the main things, which is that you have to have other symptoms besides fatigue. So it really was just the Oxford criteria, but they called it the CDC criteria because they could. And so, you know, that both of those reports were very significant and important and are very useful to be able to cite.
I'm really sorry to break it. I'm sorry, I'm here. I sort of resent the words that you use, like crap, because I more and more get the feeling that there's a moral problem here, that the medical profession has given an oath to do no harm. And, to call it, it's crap and it's sort of ridiculizing that there's actually done harm. So I have a feeling that the way that we should talk with the medical profession that is doing harm is to call on this moral oath that they gave. I just have the feeling that we have to change the words that we use when we talk to people with the medical profession who are actually doing harm.
Ben je het niet eens dan met dat CGT-Get onzin is?
Dat is ook onzin, maar
ja, dat is wat David zegt.
Ja,
niet meer en niet minder.
But it is, but the moment you talk to, I believe that it is the key to convince medical professionals by not only telling them that the strategy they use is crap, but they're also doing harm. They're harming patients. And I believe it's...
Excuse me. I really understand what you're saying, but as a ME patient for the last couple of years, I can say that if a doctor looks at you and time after time after time says to you that you have nothing, take a paracetamol and go home, then yes, that does harm.
He's harming you, but
it does harm. So I understand your point, and I do agree in the fact that saying that it's crap just doesn't achieve the goal.
Yeah, I think you've got to take the point. You've got to take the point that
it does harm.
Yeah. I think you've got to take the point that when we are discussing, this illness with senior medical colleagues at the Medical Research Council or whatever, then we're not using the word crap. When I'm discussing with some of my medical colleagues in more private circumstances, I will refer to research which is crap because some of it is, quite frankly, crap. I won't refer to a particular piece of research that came out only a few weeks ago, but I would personally use that four-letter word to describe that, and it shouldn't have ever, in my opinion, even been published. There is a lot of, let's use another word, lousy, awful, dreadful, badly thought through research being published in this area, and that does harm patients. I actually wrote an article for one of our top daily papers a year or so ago, Daily Telegraph, and it was headlined, which was, I think, something the medical profession does need to do, and it said it's time for doctors to apologise to patients with ME, because I think certain parts of my profession have done immense harm to patients with this illness, and through the research that has been carried out and the impression that that has then given to the vast majority of doctors over quite a long period of time, that this either was a non-disease or it was a disease that was just in people's minds. So the medical profession does have quite an apology to make to people. There is a lot of lousy research around. Okay, language is important, but I'm afraid some of it would, in my opinion, be reserved, wouldn't fit the word CRAP.
I would say that patients have been remarkably polite for many years, since the PACE trial came out, and published their comments in all the appropriate venues, and nothing happened. And I think at some point it's appropriate to start using curse words, not about individual doctors who are trying to do well, but these are researchers who have produced the PACE trial anyway, what I consider a piece of fraudulent research. They manipulated their data, they refused to release the original data because they didn't want to show, or they didn't release their original data because they said it wasn't good data, but they didn't release it, and it turned out to show that they manipulated and inflated all their findings. I think that's something that one can curse about, and I think that's something one can be angry about, and I think one can be angry at the journal editors as well as the authors. They knew what they were doing, I'm pretty sure, because They did, because they published research before. So I don't have any qualms about saying those things. I don't think it's appropriate to insult individual doctors who really are trying to do the best they can. I think at this point, these people are not trying to do the best they can anymore. They're trying to save their careers, and that's really all it's about for the doctors involved in this field of research.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to close the the Q&A session right now, but feel free to come up and talk to any of our panelists privately. I wanted to thank everyone again for coming. It has been a really wonderful evening. I'm really happy that you were able to join me. Thank you very much. Continued support, and hopefully I will get a chance to see some of you around again soon. Okay, so.
From as early as I can remember, I wanted to swallow the world whole. Anything was possible. I just thought I would have more time.
I don't know what I did to myself. I don't think I can get up off the couch. I feel like my brain is misfiring.
Sometimes I wouldn't be able to speak.
Wow.
If you say too little, they can't help you. And if you say too much, they think you're a mental patient.
The doctor would tell me, "You're just dehydrated." Everyone gets stressed. Then I went online and found thousands of other people just like me.
Yeah, I'm completely bedridden.
It's like I'm just watching my life disappear.
I have ME, CFS, that's chronic fatigue syndrome.
Historically, you can see illnesses very similar to this called many different things.
Saw someone collecting the other day for ME. That's the one where don't feel like going to work today.
It's gonna pass.
Okay.
Chronic fatigue syndrome. Yeah, I'm tired too.
When medicine has no answers for you, where do you turn?
Oh my God.
It's like the craziest high school science experiment you've ever done.
Just because it's crazy doesn't mean it's wrong.
You're looking at this camera.
I started filming more and more people all over the world from my bed.
Hi, Jen.
Hi.
You know what it is about being observed? It's that people feel sorry for me.
Baby, I'm so sorry.
I have the strength of a mountain.
We're kind of both organizing a day of protest as well as organizing individual protests.
All of those things, those really simple things.
There's the sun.
That life was gone, but here I have this new one.
And I'll take all you throw at me.
And I have to fight for it.